So the first character I leveled in Dragonflight was my priest, and this was specifically because I like discipline. I don't think it's particularly strong at the moment, or will be strong in Mythic Plus, but I saw Jack's Dark Disc video and got on the hype train. Now I had tested a kind of right side or dark discipline focused build earlier on in beta, back when Shadow Mend was still in the game, and back then it didn't really hold a candle compared to the old super buffed Aegis of Wrath and Harsh Discipline. But since both of those things have been fairly significantly nerfed, I thought I'd give Dark Disc another go and see how it was feeling, and that's what this video is going to be about. So what is Dark Discipline, Shadow Discipline, whatever you want to call it? It is effectively any build that focuses on the right hand side of the spec tree that is almost always going to revolve around Shadow Covenant, Stolen Psyche, and Expiation. And when I saw Jack's video, part of me said, this looks great, Jack's an amazing player, maybe this makes Disc viable, gonna try it out. And the other part of me said, Shadow Covenant does basically nothing. Schism just got nerfed. Mindbender isn't a strong cooldown. Expiation and Void Summoner and all these talents, Inescapable Torment and stuff, do no damage. I don't know why everyone's getting on the hype train here and thinking this is going to be a great build. And I would say for the most part, all of those things are still true. So Shadow Covenant just isn't strong. Shadow Mend got removed, which kind of completely wipes out any sort of shadow healing spells that Disc had, which means the Shadow Covenant is purely a button you press to heal your team, your party, and buff your shadow damaging abilities by 25%. But what Shadow Covenant does, and Stolen Psyche does, and Expiation does, is more than anything else turns Mind Blast into a very powerful atonement healing damaging ability. And this is, at least in my opinion, this is the backbone of any Dark Discipline spec. The trick, I guess you would say, of Dark Disc is that it turns Mind Blast into a hard hitting ability, which allows you to get the vast majority of your atonement healing out with Mind Blast, which then also frees up your penance to be used defensively or to use on cooldown to just spread your Poach the Wickeds. It kind of it frees up your penance so that you're not using your penance for atonement healing necessarily, and instead you can rely on Mind Blast for your atonement healing when you need it. To put it into context, I guess, these talents here, more than anything, the Stolen Psyche and Expiation, if you include Shadow Covenant in your calculations, you'll find that these talents turn Mind Blast into a button that is roughly as strong as a fully buffed Harsh Discipline 7-bolt penance. Or it's about as strong as Mind Games, except it's got a 8-second or 9-second cooldown rather than a 45-second. And when I say as strong as Mind Games, I mean the initial upfront hit of Mind Games, not the extra reverse mechanic as well. So the good part of Dark Disc is that it frees up you to use penance defensively or offensively on cooldown to just spread your Poach the Wickeds. It gives you what feels like a lot more powerful atonement healing options, and it does surprisingly good damage. This build at the moment I'm using Borrowed Time and Train of Thought, but basically these last 3 points you can put into anything you want. So the other spec I've been trying is playing with Twilight Equilibrium and Harsh Discipline, or Twilight Equilibrium and Borrowed Time again. So the other nice part about this build is Twilight Equilibrium is something that you can lean into and leverage for some more power, and it adds a lot of complexity and depth back to Discipline, which is really fun. It also enables you to do some nice things in some very heavy burst AoE moments, you can do things like Power Word Radiance into Shadow Covenant, into Power Word Radiance again, and get your Twilight Equilibrium buff on all 3 of those casts. Expiation also turns your Shadow Word Death into an enormous hit. I think by far your hardest hitting ability. Obviously the condition is that the enemy has to be below 20% health. But the fact that, especially in Mythic Plus, when you have a lot of enemies dying regularly and low health regularly, being able to hit double Shadow Word Deaths, this alone, Expiation with Shadow Word Death alone, can turn what looks like a rough fight into, you press 2 abilities basically, and you can take your entire team from half health to full health. It's that strong. Now this style of weaving your shadow and holy spells together, where you can plan out your combinations and leverage as much power from Twilight Equilibrium as possible, and you're really drawing on your entire toolkit here. This is exactly how I think Discipline should play. The problem, or the problems with Dark Disc, is that it uses a lot of mana. Most of this is going to come down to having to press Purge the Wicked very often and Mind Blast very often. Both of these spells just cost way more mana than something like Smite Spam or even Penance for that matter. And Disc already wasn't particularly great with mana to begin with. You throw things like Shadow Covenant in, and mana problems can become very apparent very quickly. So that's the first problem. Mana sucks. The second problem is that in a spec where you are effectively comboing multiple abilities together to deal with damage patterns, if you can't combo those abilities together quickly, the spec effectively stops working. And that is the second problem, low haste levels. And I would even say button bloat as well. I mean, the whole idea with Dark Disc as well is that you do not take Prayer of Mending, you do not take Power Word Solace, you do not take anything that is going to cost you globals. Even Divine Star is probably not the way to go. Probably better off to play Halo instead. But basically you're juggling so many abilities at all times, and you're trying to always combo 2, 3 or 4 abilities together to deal with certain damage patterns. Playing with low haste just makes that really, really slow. It feels like you're often 1 or 2 globals behind where you want to be at all times. And that's a problem that gets exacerbated by movement, or having to dispel, or someone standing in the fire and you've just set up your whole ramp to heal the party, or your mini ramp or whatever, and then you have to stop what you're doing to then heal the guy who stood in the fire, and that completely ruins your combo of abilities. Because that's the other part that I didn't really mention about Dark Disc, is almost all of these abilities that you're really comboing together for your powerful atonement healing throughput moments are all cooldown focused, and they all have timers. So Schism is a 9-second or 15-second window if you take Malicious Intent. Shadow Covenant is an 11-second window if you've taken Embrace Shadow. Mindbend is a 12-second window. And then obviously your atonement windows and applications and stuff on top of that, which means, there's a lot of times where you will be effectively locked into what buttons you're pressing for the next 3 or 4 seconds. And if anything causes you to not be able to press those buttons, the spec kind of fails. The other issue with Dark Disc is that it feels like it hasn't been iterated upon very well from Blizzard. Expiation eating your Purge the Wicked dot means that if you're really pumping throughput or pumping damage as much as you can, and you're using Mind Blast and Shadow Word Deaths and things on cooldown, you are going to burn through so many Purge the Wicked dots that this is going to be a button you press very often, like every 4 or 5 seconds often, like up there with Power Word Shield. The other issue is you are, with I guess all specs, is that you are effectively locked into Pain Suppression, you're locked into Barrier, and you're locked into Rapture. I would also argue that you are locked into Purge the Wicked and Revel in Purity. You're also effectively locked into Shield Discipline because you've taken Rapture, and if you don't have Shield Discipline, pressing Rapture feels like you're just burning through 20% of your mana bar for a not really a cooldown. And that is, I guess, the third issue with Discipline Priests, especially Dark Disc, is that because you're not taking the nodes that buff your Power Word Shield, that then buffs your Rapture as a cooldown, you don't have cooldowns. Rapture is not a cooldown if you play Dark Disc. Shielding someone for effectively maybe 10 to 15% of their health, one global at a time, is just not a cooldown in modern WoW. It's not comparable to things like Emerald Communion or Ascendance or even Apotheosis or anything like that. Rapture it ceases to be a good button when you're playing Dark Disc. The other thing is that you're pressing Mindbender effectively on cooldown just because you need the mana. You're also taking these 3 points down here for the same reason. You just need the mana. If you don't have Void Summoner and you don't have your Mindbender up very often, like every pack often, you will go very quickly. It's also a little bit unfortunate that is Inescapable Torment for a end tier talent option just isn't powerful at all. Just does very little damage. Even in Mythic Plus, even in the environment where you should always have up to 5 targets to hit, where it should be its strongest, it's negligible amounts of damage. I believe this was a Mythic 0 Azure Vault, and Inescapable Torment did, pitiful damage. Less damage than Power Word Shield Reflection, less damage than Schism, less than Expiation, Smite, less than my Trinket, less than everything. It was just not a great button to press, not a great ability, unfortunately, but you still feel forced to take it just for the mana. It also seems a little bit weird that the tooltip on this reads that your Smite, Mind Blast, and Penance casts reduce the cooldown of Shadow Fiend by 6 seconds or Mindbender by 2 seconds. But the only way to get to this talent is by taking Mindbender. So the Shadow Fiend line is superfluous. Like I said, it feels a little bit like this whole style or part of Discipline just hasn't been iterated upon. It feels a little bit like Blizzard just left Shadow Covenant on the tree, took away Shadow Mend, and now the players are kind of desperately trying to put the pieces together to make a Dark Disc build work. And I would say that Dark Disc is definitely better than the alternative, the normal, even like the Harsh Discipline, taking Aegis or not, the normal disc build. I think Dark Disc is better than that, but I also think both of these builds just aren't very good in Dragonflight when you compare them to how other healers play. I would love to see something like Shadow Covenant get a buff so that during Shadow Covenant's duration you can use your Shadow Word Death and it gains the full benefit as if targets were below 20% health, even if they aren't, or something to make Shadow Covenant better. There also needs to be something done about the button bloat, talent bloat that Blizzard talked about at the end of beta, the Discipline especially. There are so many nodes that feel mandatory, and then when you play, you have 10 buttons that you're trying to work through and use all roughly at the same time with like 5% haste or 10% haste. It's just not great. I'd also like to see something like Painful Punishment be buffed significantly. This is the talent that causes your Penance bolts to extend the duration of Purge the Wicked or Shadow Word Pain on your target. Anything to alleviate the downside of Expiation would be very welcome. I also don't really see the point or the reason why Purge the Wicked has such an insane mana cost on it. Same thing with Mind Blast. It's a little bit crazy to me that Mind Blast costs more mana than Mind Games, even though one of them is meant to be a medium length cooldown and the other one is supposed to be a rotational ability. And overall, either Mindbender and Shadow Fiend have to become proper, powerful cooldowns, or something has to be done to make Rapture better, or Barrier better, or something given to Discipline to give it throughput cooldowns in a 5-man environment. I understand that Barrier is exceptionally strong in Raid, but in a Mythic Plus environment, it falls short in a lot of scenarios. I'd also like to see Mindbender buffed back to maybe 0.5% mana gain per hit rather than 0.2%. Again, anything to make Disc's mana issues a little less debilitating. They aren't quite at the level of a casting Mistweaver, but they are not far off. Thanks for watching, and algorithm stuff.